Okay, so let me give you a very warm welcome to this rather experimental online summer school. My name is Jonathan Wolff. I'm the Alfred Landecker Professor of Values and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government. You can see those two logos on the screen behind me. And we're delighted to be able to host this summer school. Let me then move on to my presentation. And so this is on the topic of social inequality. So what I want to do is to talk about the history, in a way, of how I came to some of the views I have on the topic of equality and inequality, and to try to locate them in a number of broader contexts. So to begin at the beginning, I was an undergraduate in UCL, the University College London, in 1980 to 1983. And one of my teachers there was a philosopher, G.A. Cohen, Jerry Cohen, who's a very important philosopher in thinking about Marxism and thinking about topics of equality. So 1980, when I was an undergraduate, Rawls's theory of justice had only been out for 9 years, and Nozick's Anarchy, State and Utopia had only been out for a few years as well. And this really formed the background to the work we did in political philosophy then, just as much as, in a way, for many of you, it still does now. But my teacher, Jerry Cohen, was particularly worried about a criticism Nozick and others had made of egalitarianism, which is that it ignores the place of individual responsibility. That he was worried about the criticism that if we're going to share everything equally, doesn't that mean we will subsidize people who don't work for the common good? That if we're sharing out everything equally, people who work hard and people who don't work hard, even if they could, will get the same. So it was thought, and isn't this unfair? So part of the libertarian critique of equality was that equality ignored the position of individual responsibility in determining people's fate and fortune. So this was seen to be a weakness in the account, and Cohen was particularly worried about it. Later on, Cohen wrote a paper called "Why Libertarianism Worries Some Marxists More Than It Does Any Egalitarian Liberal," a paper with a title like that, maybe one of the less elegant titles of his papers. But as a Marxist, he was particularly worried about the place of individual responsibility and even, in a sense, individual rights, although he wouldn't have put it like that in a position of equality. So when I was a graduate student, I was still at UCL for a couple of years, Cohen ran a seminar where he had us read Dworkin's then brand new papers on equality. So Dworkin wrote two very long papers on equality in 1981. What is Equality Part 1 and What is Equality Part 2? And the great innovation for Cohen was that Dworkin had been able to show how to reconcile responsibility with equality. And the way that Dworkin does this is to say that people should be responsible for their freely made choices, but not for their circumstances that are outside their range of choice. So in other words, if you were born, to use Dworkin's examples, if you're born with a low talent, and that's why you can't work very productively, then you are entitled to subsidy from the rest of society. But if you don't work because you choose to surf all day off Malibu, then that's your choice. No one's going to stop you surfing, but you won't get subsidized by the rest of society. So this view, which you will know from Elizabeth Anderson's later title, Luck Egalitarianism, was presented by Dworkin in those papers written in 1981. 1984, I was in a seminar with Cohen, and Cohen was very excited that Dworkin had solved the problem that Nozick had put to equality. So Nozick's position was that individual responsibility refutes equality, but Dworkin had shown how you could reconcile responsibility and equality. So I'm sure many of you already know this. Now, one day, we had seminars, several in a row. One day, as I was coming out of the seminar, we'd just heard Cohen's interpretation of Dworkin, and Cohen seemed to be, at that time, an enthusiastic supporter. But another faculty member who wasn't a political philosopher came out of the seminar, and as we were leaving, he said to me, "That's the most right-wing nonsense I've ever heard in my life." And I thought, well, what are you talking about? This is the cutting edge political philosophy. This is cutting edge political philosophy. It's egalitarianism. It's as far left as we get at the moment in political philosophy, and you're calling it a right-wing view. So why on earth are you calling it a right-wing view? So at the time I dismissed it, but of course I didn't dismiss it because I remembered it, and it nagged away and nagged away and nagged away at me. Why would anyone call this a right-wing view? But in a way, it's obvious why it's a right-wing view, because what it suggests is that you are only entitled to benefits, for example, unemployment benefits, if you are unemployed not as a matter of choice, but a matter of bad luck. Okay, so if you choose to be unemployed, then you don't get unemployment benefits. Well, that may seem fair, but what does it mean in practice? Well, what it means in practice is that you go to the unemployment office and they give you quite a rigorous inquisition to see why you're unemployed. They don't just accept your word that you're unemployed and you don't have a job. They say, why are you unemployed? Why haven't you got a job? And they would try to change your choices so you do have a job. You do try to change a job, obtain a job. Now, that was exactly what was happening in British welfare reform at that point. I call it reform, but this was the Margaret Thatcher years in Britain. And we had moved from a system whereby if you claimed unemployment benefit, you just went and you registered as unemployed. No one was really too worried about why you were claiming or not. But then we moved to a system which was much more inquisitive and punitive, trying to stop people claiming by hassling them and asking them questions. And what my UCL colleague meant was that luck egalitarianism seemed to be the same view. Luck egalitarianism seemed to be the view that if you could work, then you should work for yourself and you don't get any benefit from society. Well, you might agree, but then the question comes, how do we implement that policy? To implement luck egalitarianism seems to mean we have to have means testing and inquisitive welfare systems. So that caused me a lot of problems thinking about that, because, as I said, this was a cutting edge left-wing egalitarian view. My teacher, the former Marxist Jerry Cohen, believed it. Dworkin believed it. Many people believed it, but it seemed to me to lead to these very punitive welfare state policies. So, for example, to talk a little bit about my family history, my mother had an industrial injury and as a result couldn't work for a while, and she got disability benefits. But every year she had to undergo a test, and she had to strip naked in front of 3 doctors who are normally men she'd never seen before and blow into a bag to show that her lung capacity was low, right, in order to qualify for her disability benefit. As you can imagine, she was absolutely humiliated by doing this. And why should we force anyone to do that? Why can't we just trust people to say that they would make claims only if they needed to? Now, you may say that's naive, we'll be exploited. We've got to make sure that people only claim benefits if they're entitled to it. But the thought is that there should be at least a balance, and we shouldn't go straight to this type of means testing or capacity testing. And when I thought about it, I thought, now I think of myself as an egalitarian. I believe in equality. Do I think a system of equality should require people to blow in a bag naked in front of strangers in order to get benefits from the state. That doesn't sound like a society of equality to me. That sounds like a society where some people are humiliated in order to get what they are entitled to. So when I thought to myself, what is it that I believe when I think about a society, when I think about equality? What attracts me to equality? Well, it's not the idea that everyone should get the same amount of stuff. It's not the idea that the state should somehow work out how responsible people are for their own situation in life. What attracts me is the idea that we can have a society of equals. And by a society of equals, I mean a society where we respect each other and treat each other as equals. We take people at their word unless we've got reason to dispute it. No one looks up, no one looks down. So this is the idea that a society of equals is defined by relations between individuals rather than distribution of stuff. And so looking back at Dworkin's view, you can see Dworkin had a very distributional view of equality, that Dworkin and Cohen and others thought that equality was about distributing something equally, or at least distributing chances of those things equally. So Cohen, in one of his papers, says that I take for granted that an equal society will distribute something equally. There'll be this thing that everyone gets. Is it happiness? Is it standard of living? Is it resources? Is it income? Is it basic capabilities? We should all get an equal amount of this thing. That's a distributive view. Well, I came to think that's a very bad way of thinking about equality. Equality is really about how we treat each other, not what we get. And so I move away from a distributional view, and in particular, I move away from the luck egalitarian view, which makes this very important concession to individual responsibility. And I think that a society of equals is constituted by the relations between people. So I call this a view of social equality. And I wrote about this, I published in the late 90s, roughly at the same time. Elizabeth Anderson also wrote a very important, very powerful paper where she used the term luck egalitarianism for the first time, and she presented what has become known as relational equality. So my view, I suppose, is a variant of relational equality, and Sam Scheffler and many others now have also presented very similar views, all of which really draw in a way on the work of Iris, Marion Young. So the critique initially comes from Justice and the Politics of Difference. For me, it took about 10 years for the importance of that critique to sink in. And I think I had to reinvent it to realize really where it had come from for me, and others I think have had the same experience. So the view of social equality says that what matters in a society of equals is how human beings relate to each other. We need to treat people as equals, respect each other as equals. No one looks down, no one looks up. So the enemies of equality, in the words of the English philosopher from the 1930s, R.H. Tawney, a society of equals has no snobbery within it and no servility. Okay, so I know some people want the references to the people I'm talking about. After this is over, I will share a paper or a couple of papers which gives much more information about the sources that I'm talking about. Okay, so the view I'm presenting then is one in which society or equality is about relations of equality. But then the question comes, how do we define this view in more detail? It's all very well to say that a society of equals is one where people relate to each other in particular ways. We may understand that. You may think you're in a group of equals with your friends. You have a particular way of relating. Maybe you're a member of a department that seems very equal to you, and you think there are ways that you relate between each other. But what are these ways? What are these ways? And that's a very difficult question. So David Miller, who is another person who argued for this view, social equality, even before Anderson and myself. He wrote, it's very easy to say what social egalitarians are against. We're against exploitation. We're against discrimination. We're against hierarchy. We're against oppression. We're against violence. There are many things that we're against, but it's much harder to say what we're for. So what is the positive relation of equality that should tie a society of equals together? Now, that is a very good question. And I puzzled over this for a while. I couldn't make very much progress with it. Because on the one hand, you say, well, maybe it's about treating everyone decently, respecting everyone. Well, that's true, but that doesn't give you much of a political philosophy. So it's very hard to move in the direction of a positive theory of social equality. What are these relations of social equality? And I had a couple of PhD students working on this. I thought, great, they can write their thesis and they can tell me what the relations of social equality are. They did good work, but they didn't really solve that problem. And so for a while, I made no progress. And then it came to me, well, maybe what we should just do is turn this upside down. So instead of saying that what matters is social equality, maybe we should say what matters is social inequality. That is, what we should do is just rest content with this idea that we as egalitarians know what we're against. We want a society without oppression. We want a society without violence. We want a society without marginalization, without exclusion. So this, in a way, gives a type of priority to injustice, a priority to inequality. And it goes with non-ideal theory. So non-ideal theory says we should start from the real world. My negative version of social equality, the theory of social inequality, does the same thing. It says we should stop fussing around trying to come up with a definition of what a society of equals is in positive terms. Maybe we'll never do it. Maybe we'll have too many. But instead of thinking about that philosophical task, primarily, of trying to define equality, what we should do simply is to look at the most manifest injustices in the world in which we live, and we should do what we can to join with others to address those inequalities. So, for example, I've done quite a lot of work on disability. So disability, until recently, was a neglected topic in political philosophy. Why was it neglected? Well, one of the reasons why it was neglected is that in the theory of justice, Rawls starts from the assumption that everyone is within a normal range of health, as he calls it. So in our leading work of egalitarian political philosophy, there is no mention even of disability as a subject that needs analysis at a fundamental level. So that's brushed aside as a topic to come back to. A few years ago, the Joseph Rowntree Trust here in the UK asked me to write a survey of philosophical works on poverty. Okay, so think of that. What are the philosophical works on poverty that you know? Okay, so a lot of people in global justice talk about the world poverty, but think about domestic poverty, poverty within one country. Who are the great theorists in political philosophy of poverty? But there's almost no one really who's made poverty a main part of their study in political philosophy. So why is that? Well, that might be because we're so interested in a just society, and in a just society, there's no poverty, of course, that poverty doesn't become part of the conceptual repertoire that we have to deal with. But of course, when you think about politics in the real world and distribution in the real world, poverty is perhaps the most important question that we talk about all the time. So it's embarrassing, with one or two exceptions, Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum to some degree, very few philosophers have even made a systematic study of the concept of poverty. So what I'm suggesting then is that we turn the question upside down, we look at the sources of inequality in the world, and we do our work as philosophers to try to join with other people and activists who are trying to address these problems of inequality and injustice, and to give them our help rather than try to define social equality. Now, there are many objections to this. And I'm beginning to see some already. So let me remind you that you should put your questions, if you have any, in the Q&A, and then they will be fed onto me later on. I'm already seeing a number of questions coming through. So thank you for listening. I'll take a glass of water and then I'll start looking at the questions, and I will tell you what they are as they appear. Okay, so the first question is from Niharika Rana, who says, if we only look the relations between individuals as the definition of equality, where does a state stand in this? Okay, so that's a fantastic question. So here, what I've said is that a society of equals is one where we treat each other in particular ways. There are relations between us. And so it's a very good question to say, well, what about the state? Does the state have no role at all in creating equality or reducing inequality? And there are several ways in which people have tried to deal with this question. So the philosopher Christian Schemmel has said that actually relational equality is only about how the state treats individuals. So the state might discriminate against individuals. The state may tax some unfairly. The state in some cases may even engage in some forms of genocide against its citizens. Those are obvious ways in which the state has not treated individuals as equals. So I think that is right, that the state has a role in whether or not people are going to be treated as equals. So the state can treat people very much as unequals. But I wouldn't want to say it's only about the state. It's only about how the state treats people. I think we have also responsibilities. But I would say, in my view, the state has a type of facilitating role. So take, for example, one of the worst forms of injustice and inequality, which is serious domestic violence. What is the state's role there? Well, the state's role, of course, is not to perpetrate domestic violence. The state can't do that, but the state should make it very difficult for people to be violent to their partners and get away with it. So there should be a type of discouragement of the state. The state ought to be able to discourage people from engaging in domestic violence, and the state should also educate and facilitate. So the state has a big role in creating relations between individuals. The state can do many things. I mean, here's another example. One of the things I worry a lot about is social exclusion. And in the UK, we have a problem in that the architecture of many places where poorer people live is very alienating. So people were taken from inner cities in the 1950s and 60s. People who are living in the slums in the cities were taken from those neighborhoods and put in tower blocks, either nearby or even in some cases quite far away. That improved their housing conditions, so it was good in that respect. People had hot water and bathrooms and so on, but it took them away from their neighbors, and it caused a lot of mental health problems and other types of deprivation. So the state created, inadvertently, social exclusion through its policies of town planning. So I think it's very important that the state, when it does things like planning decisions, thinks not just in terms of how many bathrooms and bedrooms people will have, what sort of communities are they creating? And are they going to create communities where people feel lonely and excluded? Or are they going to create societies where people are able to feel valued alongside their neighbors? So the state, I think, does have a particular role. So excellent question, so thank you. So we have a question from Abdul Rashid Isa, but wouldn't the way people treat each other be heavily influenced by material possessions? This can make relational equality simply a matter of wealth and endowment. Okay, so this is another superb question. So thank you for these questions, and do keep them coming, though I'm not sure I'm going to have time to address everything as we go through. Though actually having the questions written down does seem to save a certain amount of time. So this is another good innovation. So let me take this question as a question about what is the relation between social and material equality, or social and material inequality. And by concentrating on social inequality, some people think, and this question implies it, although it does it quite politely, that I'm tolerating great material inequality. In fact, I read a book last year that said that this point had been made in the wake of the French Revolution. So what happened with the French Revolution, of course, is that the aristocracy were overturned, and supposedly the revolution brought about the emancipation of all French people. So everyone became social equals. But after the French Revolution, there were still enormous inequalities in wealth. And people who had very little income and wealth complained and said that, you said we're going to bring about equality, but look, we've got this material inequality. And the rich defended themselves apparently by saying, well, no, we're all social equality. We all have social equality now. We're all equals. We're all equal citizens. That's enough for equality. And of course, that was just an ideological move to hide inequality under quite serious wealth inequality. So the thought is, I think, and the thought behind this question is that if you're going to have a society of equals, then you can only tolerate a certain level of material inequality. So if you have vast material inequality, you don't really have a society of equals anymore. And I'm sympathetic to that. I think if you have vast inequalities, it's very hard to say you've got a society of equals, even if people treat each other well. If you've got people starving, living next to people in mansions, or huge penthouse flats, £1 million flats or multi-million-pound flats, and there are people starving next door, you can't say you're living in a society of equals. But that's really because these material inequalities, the material inequalities, are a symbol of a lack of respect for people who are dispossessed. But notice, I'm not saying social equality needs material equality. I don't think that's true. I think you can have some inequality in society and still have a society of equals. I think what we need is to avoid the gross inequalities that we see around ourselves. So if someone was to say that the United States or the United Kingdom or India at the moment are societies of equals, because say we've all got the vote, that would be laughable. We're not societies of equals because we have very wealthy people alongside people who are very, very poor. So let me see where we have got to on the questions. We have a lot of very good questions here. Okay, so we've got a question from Alessandro Soccer. If we've not a definition about social equality, how can we promote it when we haven't found situations? I think there may be a typo here. If we have not a definition of social equality, how can we promote it when we find situations of social inequality? So let me put this question my way, which is to say that how can we even talk about inequality unless we've got a theory of equality? How can we know that something is unequal unless we have a theory of equality? So I think this is philosophically, this is a very important question. And it raises a lot of concerns, a lot of issues we could raise. So one is a type of semantic question, which is to say, so this assumes that equality has some sort of logical priority over inequality. But does it? Is it just because one's called equality and the other is called inequality? I mean, suppose we change the words around and we had a positive word for inequality and a negative word for equality. Would that change things? Well, you might think that's just a trick. But the more important thing to say is think about cases where you make an intuitive judgment. So I do quite a bit of work, or have done in the past, on the topic of exploitation. And most of us, I think, are prepared to say that something is exploitative. So you might hear of someone working in a factory and getting paid a tiny amount of money, well below the minimum wage. And you say, well, that is obviously exploitative. They're obviously being exploited. And maybe no one would disagree. But then if I said to you, well, how can you tell me that's exploitative unless I know your theory of exploitation? Tell me what would not be exploitative. What's the cutoff? Give me the cutoff between exploitation and not exploitation. Now, some people can do this. Some Marxists have got a theory of exploitation. Some free marketeers have got a theory of exploitation. But most of us don't really have a theory of exploitation. We think we can see exploitation. We can know exploitation when we see it. There are clear cases. We can make clear judgments, but we don't do it because we've got a theory. And I think the same can be true of inequality. So when I see a group being discriminated against, I might not have a very clear idea of what equality would be in those circumstances. Maybe there are reasons why they can't do exactly the same. So at the moment, it's a very difficult question within feminism to know what would equality between men and women be, given that there are some biological differences between men and women. So what would it really be to have a society of equals between men and women? That is a tough question, and there's not complete agreement. Despite that, there are many cases where we can agree that there is inequality. Now, do we do that because we've got a theory of equality in our heads? Well, I don't think so, because we don't have a theory of equality in our heads, but we seem to be able to judge inequality exists even without equality. Okay, so sorry, that was a long answer. It's one of my favorite topics to discuss, and no one ever agrees with me, so I'm sure I didn't satisfy the person who answered that question, but I at least had a go. All right, so now we have a question from Lakshmi. Sorry, my eyes are not very good. Karlika. How do developing countries promote equality when they're engulfed in poverty, inequality, etc.? Well, that is a very good question. I think one way of thinking about this is in relation to human rights, which is not something that I expected to be talking about right now, but it comes to mind. So one of the things I've been working on, gave a class on it yesterday, is on the human right to health. Now, the same question comes up for poor countries. How can you even talk about a human right to health when countries have so little resources? If you're in a poor country, how can you realize the right to health for everyone? Now, what the drafters of the conventions have done on human rights is to say, well, we have to accept what they call progressive realization, that you have to work towards it, and if you don't have the resources, you can't be criticized for not having a full system of high level of health services in your country. But they say there are some obligations which are core obligations that you cannot breach. That is, there are some things that having no money is not an excuse for. What are they? Well, giving medical care to men but not women, for example. That would be something you can't justify by saying you don't have the resources. Or not giving medical resources to a minority religion, or doing other things that discriminate between your people. So in other words, there are some forms of equality which are not expensive and can be done even in poorer resource settings, but very often they're not done. So for example, the ruling elite may hoard wealth to themselves. Well, if they do that, they're violating equality, and poverty and inequality, or poverty and material deprivation, is no excuse for that. So I'd say the way to do this, the way to do everything, is to fight the battles you may have a chance of winning. That is to think about the sources of inequality that are not justified even in a low resource setting. That's at least the start. Okay, there's a comment from Pranav Darwan. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar has emphasized the targeting of inequality over equality through his draft constitution of the Indian Republic. Perhaps it's a good idea to explore his ideas. So I have read his works. I don't remember reading that. It's definitely something that I should go back to. It's not something I have a comment on at the moment. So thank you as well. We have a question. I've been reminded by the AV team that Taylor and Sam could put a question directly to me if they have a question. You don't have to do it this minute, but if you want to put a question to me, just turn your microphone on at the appropriate moment when I pause, or wave your hand and let me know. Okay, it's a bit strange just sitting there, but you're welcome to do it otherwise. Okay, Najma Mohammed asks, born in apartheid South Africa, so we feel like social equality was just the first step in our journey towards an equal and just society. There's a critical need to address racial injustice, which left the majority of people in debilitating structural poverty that persists to this day along racial lines. Seems like there has to be a distributional dimension here to achieve social and economic justice. Well, South Africa is such an interesting example. So of course, apartheid South Africa was about as socially unequal as you could have, where some people were denied the vote, the majority were denied the vote on the basis of the color of their skin. So post-apartheid South Africa, that has changed. And so everyone now can vote, everyone can stand for public office. And Black South Africans, of course, have been very successful in being elected to public office. But how much change has there been? So I visited South Africa, it must have been about 6 or 7 years ago. And this was a topic that everyone wanted to talk about. And people were arguing that material inequality had increased since the end of apartheid, that some Black South Africans had become very wealthy, but for most Black South Africans, economically, the situation had not changed or got worse. And even though apartheid had gone, what people called the geography of apartheid remains, which is Black South Africans living in completely different neighborhoods, much poorer neighborhoods to white South Africans. So it is absolutely clear that material inequality is enormous in South Africa. It's almost like two countries living on the same land still. And that has a social dimension as well as a material dimension. And we may talk about similar things in Tommy's session on race, but when I was reading African-American political thought, Black political thought, I was really struck by a comment by Malcolm X, who, of course, lived in the United States, became a Muslim, and he traveled to the Middle East. And he said that he'd grown up to think of all white people as devils, but in the Middle East, he met some white people who didn't seem as bad as the white Americans that he'd met. And he said, when they say they're white, all they're doing is talking about the color of their skin, an incidental feature. But in America, when an American says he's white, he means he's the boss. So I found this a really interesting comment, that in America, if someone says they're white, okay, that can mean anything now, but there was a time in the 1960s when it meant you had certain privileges over Black Americans just in virtue of the color of your skin. And I don't know if this is still true in South Africa, but certainly when I was there about 7 years ago, I felt there was a little bit of a legacy of this. When I saw how white South Africans talked to Black shop workers, for example, how they ordered bus drivers around, they seemed to feel that they had a natural right to govern, a natural right to privilege. I don't know if that's still the case. I'm sure it hasn't changed very much. So that's a social inequality and not just a material inequality. So I think in South Africa, the two things go hand in hand. You have to know how to, you have to attack both at the same time. They are mutually reinforcing. So social inequalities cause material inequalities. Who gets the job, who gets the privileges. who gets advantage, who gets a place at university, and material inequality causes social inequality. So there is a relation between the two. And how you break it, well, it needs to be done. I wish I had the magic answer, but I don't have the answer to that, but it definitely needs to be done. Okay, Sanima KK, how will you assess the role of communism and capitalism in defining the individual sense of equality, as well as the relationship between the individual and state? The role of communism and capitalism in defining the individual sense of equality, as well as relationship between the individual and state. Yeah, so this is a great question. So the experience of communism is something for most people that has been largely in the past in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. We might say Cuba is still a communist country, North Korea, they're very different. My far left friends have been pointing out to me how well Cuba has been doing fighting the COVID crisis compared to many other countries, that it's been a lesson to us all. I think all I can do is answer this anecdotally. So I had a student who, as a child, had grown up in one of the Soviet Central Asian countries. And he said they were very poor. They had enough to eat, they had clothes, but they had no luxuries in life. And he said that there was a shopkeeper who, he had the local shop, but every now and again he'd just be very tired. He was an old man. He'd go upstairs and have a sleep in his bed, and he'd leave the shop open. And people would come in, if they wanted to take anything, they'd take it and they would leave money in the communist era. And no one would think of taking the money or not paying for the goods. There was just a sense of community where people knew what they had to do. They would never do this, he said, in the new capitalist regime. But the idea that you would leave your money open or leave the goods open unguarded. So I think he said that although there had been great economic development under capitalism, there'd been loss of something, and that there was a loss of this sense of community. Maybe people did think of themselves as equals. They certainly regarded themselves in a different way, and I think that is a loss. But there's another question about what you can do on a large scale. So now I live in London. The idea that we could somehow move to a system where everyone would trust each other, they'd leave shops unattended and so on, that seems unrealistic, whatever the economic system is. So I think communism has had its successes, but what it can achieve on a larger scale is not so clear. Okay, so we have a question from Patrick Nogoy. Relations between individuals are also defined by their particular commitments and identities, such as religion and culture. These social differences may qualify as permissible inequalities. How does a social egalitarian approach this and the distributive implications of such particular commitments to conceptions of the good? Okay, so the difference in identities between religion and culture, are they permissible inequalities? Well, it would be tough to say they're not permissible, that it's tough to say a society of equals, everyone has to join the same religion or no religion. So I certainly wouldn't want to say that. So are they inequalities? They're differences. Are they inequalities? They could lead to inequalities. So different groups could have different cultures, and that could lead some to be more materially successful rather than others. But maybe I'm not seeing completely what the problem is here. The idea would be, people have to be respected as equals. Okay, maybe I'm seeing it now. I remember putting this view forward many years ago at a seminar, and there was a philosopher there, or political scientist, who specialized in multiculturalism. And he said that social equality might have been very good for Britain in the 1920s or 30s, when everyone was from a predominantly Christian, predominantly white. But with mass immigration and the changing nature of society, social equality was a myth, really, in modern Britain. And my only answer to that is to say that I'm not trying to give us a model of equality, because I don't think I can do that. I don't think I can give us a positive model of equality. What I'm trying to do is to say that a society of equals is one that would avoid pernicious inequalities, that inequalities that treat people as unworthy or treat people in an exploitative or a manipulative way. So then the question is, do these differences between identities and religions treat people in a demeaning way? And in truth, yes, sometimes they do. Sometimes people of minority religions are demeaned, sometimes women are demeaned, sometimes people of particular sexual identities are demeaned. Those would all be things we would want to consider in the approach of social inequality. But Gnosis, the point wouldn't be to make everyone the same. It would be to make everyone respected in their differences, to allow everyone to be accommodated however they are. Now that may seem utopian, but that is what the approach would lead us to. Okay, so Jimmy James asks, don't you think it is an idealist view to believe that social equality can be achieved through rather philosophical means than through concrete down-to-earth steps like redistribution of resources? In the former case, doesn't it demand a bit too much from humans as civic beings? Okay, so this is a good question to anyone putting forward a philosophical view of any sort, that how will your view make a difference in the world? And it is true that people who talk about distributive justice have some chance of making a difference in the world. When we have a Labour government in the UK, they sometimes talk to political philosophers like me, thinking about theories of justice and how we would change tax and transfer. And I am not arguing that we should stop that. I think material redistribution is very, very important. But I think it's important because it is the way I put it, it's either a cause or a consequence or a symbol of social inequality. So material inequality causes social inequality, or is caused by social inequality, or is a symbol of social inequality. So material equality or material inequality is really important, but not for its own sake. One of the things I said I've worked on is poverty, and there the common view now is we should think in terms of relative poverty, and relative poverty is not having enough to fit in with your society. So this is a very interesting idea, because poverty we think of as a material idea, it's a distributive idea, but actually in the view that I favor, not having enough to fit in, not having enough to do what's normally expected in your society, that looks much more like a social idea of social equality. So poverty and social equality go together. So my answer is that I will pay a lot of attention to material distribution, but it's because of its effects on people, not because there's something magic in having equality. So what have I been asked here? Will I mind scrolling up to address some of the upvoted questions? I've lost my track here. I don't think that is possible for me with what I've got. But anyway, where have I got to? All right. How do we reduce blur entrenched inequalities that don't depend on material inequalities? For instance, as Ambedkar puts it, in India, there's a division of laborers and not division of labor. Certain groups are assigned certain jobs based on their caste. How can the state be involved to make the society more relationally equal in this case? So that is such a stubbornly difficult question, isn't it? That if there's ever an example of social inequality, it would be something like the caste system. And then there's going to be a question, is it even possible to achieve social equality if you have a caste system that involves equality in that way. And so I was amazed reading a little bit of anthropology about Nepal, actually, that I saw that some low caste Indians had changed religion to religions that treated everyone as equals, such as Christianity or Buddhism. And so their thought is that the religion itself is one of inequality and is problematic. So people who know about Indian religion rather than me have to address this. There's a question about whether we can actually achieve social equality within the Hindu religion. Sam, you've got a question. Do you want to ask it to put your mic on?
Yeah, I just wondered if you'd talk about the relationship between democracy and social equality, and whether we should expect democracies to be enhanced as a result of greater social equality.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this is going to have to be my last question as the time is going. I mean, so there are people who've written about the relation between social equality and democracy. And from their writings, it seems that if we get good enough democracy, if we get real participatory democracy, then there's a sense in which we've got social equality because everyone's voice will be heard as an equal. But I think you're asking the question the other way around, that if we overcome social inequality, will democracy be improved? Well, it could be. It could be. Now, I haven't thought about this question, but what it puts me in mind of is something at the beginning of On Liberty, John Stuart Mill on Liberty. And Mill says that when theorists of democracy were putting democracy forward, they thought that democracy would be the solution to all of our problems. Why is that? Well, because if the people are making laws for themselves, then why would the people ever pass oppressive laws? Why would you pass bad laws if you're passing them for yourself? Why would you pass discriminatory laws? And he said, well, what we've learned, of course, is that there's such a thing as the tyranny of the majority, and that people who have power may use it for their own ends, and there's division in society. So there is a view, I suppose, that comes from this. It says the more similar people are in terms of their interests and material possessions and their goals, the more likely it is that we could agree on the same laws, that we wouldn't be opposed to each other in the same way. Well, yeah, maybe that's utopian. Maybe we'll find other ways of being opposed to each other. This is rather like Freud's criticism of Marx. So Marx, in some of his writings, seemed to think that once we've achieved material equality, that will be the end of all of our problems. But Freud points out, you know, I've got a lesson for you, I've got a bad news for you, Dr. Marx, that even if we have material equality, people are going to find other things to fight about. For example, who's a member of the party and who isn't. And so inequality will reproduce itself. Okay, so I know we've got lots of questions left. Thank you very much. I think what I will do, if it's possible, I will try and take them and perhaps provide a bit of documentation afterwards and a further bit of reading for you so you can follow up the references that I have made. There's a couple of papers in mind that I can do that. So we've got your email addresses from the sign up. Thank you so much for staying with us. Thank you so much for the questions and your attention.